Manchester University, where anyone who urgently wishes to know whether 2 to the power of 127 minus 1 is a prime number or not, can be given the answer by an electronic brain in 25 minutes instead of by a human brain in 6 months.
In 1949, the Manchester Baby was declared the world's first modern computer, and its birth caused huge excitement in the scientific world. But it was impossible to imagine that this room full of valves and wires would one day evolve into the home computer.
It was the first computer to have all the characteristics of what you would expect now in a computer, what your PC has. So it had memory, it could store program and data, and it could execute it. It had very primitive input-output, but it was a genuine computer.
The computer itself contains 1,500 valves. The brain at present is only in the experimental stage, the answer being read from a cathode ray tube. Later, an automatic keyboard will type the answer.
With technological advances, these electronic brains became more powerful and more sophisticated, although you still had to be a computer scientist to operate one.
It's almost impossible to imagine where we are now from where we were then. It's just a huge, huge difference. And it gives you a different approach to how you actually work with computers as well, because now you can be fairly free and easy. You can try out something. If it doesn't work, you can have another go 5 minutes later, 2 minutes later. Very often, we would only get one test of our program overnight, so in a 24-hour period. And under those circumstances, you worked quite hard to check that your program was correct, because you wanted the answers. It would be very frustrating. You had 24 hours to wait until it was your turn again.
What changed these slow, clumsy machines was the arrival of the microchip in the 60s. It was a revolution. It meant computers could now be smaller and have much shorter processing times. The advances in technology were taking place at a breathtaking pace, generating huge excitement for the potential of computers.
There was dramatic advances in miniaturization of computer technology. For many people, it was simply unbelievable. It was held up as the paradigm case of technological advance for a very long time. Nothing like it, or so people thought, had been seen. Not in any industry, not in manufacture, not in things like the development of the car. It simply appeared that technology was running away with itself to many people. The computers were getting so much smaller, they were getting so much faster. People were asking themselves where it was going to end.
The paranoid fears of those worried about the spread of computer technology were often realized in the science fiction dramas of the day.
Are you seriously telling me, sir, that you have invented a machine that can think?
Yes.
And never makes mistakes?
Never.
Some people genuinely did fear the computer. Very many people seriously thought that as computers got smaller and as they got faster, they would become intelligent. They would eventually become more intelligent than humans.
But the imagined dangers of dabbling with computers didn't dampen enthusiasm for this new phenomenon. In the late 60s and early 70s, groups of hobbyists were busily experimenting with early computers.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Hobby Computer Club. I notice there are a number of faces here that we haven't seen before.
For these enthusiasts, it was the arrival of a computer kit called the Altair, which brought their dream of a home computer that much closer.
You had to build it yourself, and even when you built it, it barely worked. You programmed it by flicking a few switches, and to show what it was doing, it had a few lights that flashed. It was an almost unusable computer, but it was a computer, and yet there's a massive demand for it.
You could in fact buy an Altair ready assembled, so for that reason it is usually described as the first home computer.
Although it was called a home computer, not many homes had an Altair. A far more popular experience of computer technology was to be found in the gaming arcades of the early 70s.
I like to describe myself as a leisure time technologist. And what that really means is I like to apply technology to the process of having fun.
Nolan Bushnell, an American hobbyist, had exploited the technology of the microchip in a new way. He put his self-programmed computer games into bars, proving they had universal appeal. His company, Atari, was then one of the first to introduce a games console into the home.
The first domestic computer game was Pong. These early computer games machines weren't like the consoles that were to come. They were dedicated. They could only play one game, but they plugged into a television.
And they had little great variations where the one we had a little games console, I think it was a Binatone one, where it promised, 10 great games. You thought, oh, that's fantastic. Someone else has just got Pong, this has got 10 games. But they're all like exactly the same. You had kind of tennis, which was the original Pong, and then you had football, which was like Pong, but with 2 bats that moved up and down at the same time. And then they had hockey, which had the same 2 bats, but they put a little goal forward instead of a gap, and it was all exactly the same kind of variations of it. But we loved it. It was absolutely mesmerising. There was something very hypnotic about just that plain kind of white thing moving on a black background. Almost kind of sucked you in.
Whilst game consoles had entered the home market, none of the big companies recognised that there was a demand for a home computer. It was left to small electronics firms and the hobbyists themselves to create a commercial market. In Britain, that would be entrepreneur Clive Sinclair.
The very first one was the ZX80, which it actually came out in 1979, and then there was a rather smarter one the next year, the ZX81. We knew that there would be a market for the ZX80 with hobbyists because that already existed. But I hoped that there'd be a market that was much greater than that in terms of people who had never thought of owning a computer, i.e. members of the public, and that turned out to be the case. There were 2 sections. One was for very young people, which was perhaps not so surprising, but the other was retired people. And they took to it very much because they'd got time available to spend to learn how to use it, and so retired people were a very big market.
Sinclair's aim was to produce a computer that people could afford, rather than a computer that had a practical purpose. And yet people still bought it anyway, because it was interesting, because it was a novelty.
To load a program, you had to have a tape recorder, and you connected it up. You were very careful when you were connecting it up. You'd press play, it would make its wonderful noise, and 5 minutes later it would go, program not loaded, and you'd have to start again. It's incredibly unfriendly. Of course, in those days we didn't care because we didn't know that things could be better. It was still wonderful, the fact you could load programs.
The ZX80 and its immediate successor, the ZX81, were astonishingly successful. But for Sinclair, the best was yet to come.
Following that, we brought out the ZX Spectrum, which was the first one that had colour, and then the sales really took off, and we sold many millions of those. And indeed, I learned the other day that the Russians still use them very widely for running just about everything over there. They copied them illegally, but there we are.
In 1982, the BBC began a campaign to educate the nation about computers. The Thatcher government was keen to try and make the British population the most computer literate in the world.
The BBC Computer Literacy Project was set up with the aim of educating the public about computers. At the end of the 70s, there had been a lot of fear about which way computer technology was going, whether we were going to be engulfed by this new technology, which we simply didn't understand. So this whole raft of programs, the computer program, Micro Live, programs of that kind came in.
What happens next?
Well, we have to load the program into the machine. So you type load.
LOAD.
Now we've got to give it the name of the program. So in this particular machine, we have to use quotation marks to give it the name. So quotation marks, and the name of the game is Wall. It's the old Wall game.
Right.
Now we must switch on the cassette.
Yes.
And then hit return. And that puts the control back to the computer. And now it's beginning to search.
Right.
What's interesting if you look at those programs is how technical they are, the level at which they're pitched. It's assumed that you're going to get into the computer, that you need to understand the basics of how it works, the nuts and bolts, if you like.
So that's in there.
That's it. So we can switch it off.
And presumably we can check, can we, that what was on there is in there now?
Happily, yes. All you have to do is to type out list and it'll tell you what's in it.
But it wasn't just a campaign involving TV programs. In what was quite a remarkable piece of social intervention, the BBC commissioned a computer, made by Acorn, with the idea of allocating one to every school in the country. It was known as the BBC Micro.
I remember my first impression of a BBC Micro was our school had one. And I think almost all schools, because of the programme that they were sold through, had one. And we saw it at the front of the class. We had to squint to see what was on it, and we were told this is a wonderful thing you could do wonderful things with. What the marketers were playing on was this idea that this was a machine you could have for the home. That was new. And the idea of having a computer in the home was like having a chemical engineering plant in the home. You know, it was entirely unlikely a few decades before, but by the 80s they could convincingly sell you this idea that the home computer would do everything in the home, even things you didn't even know you wanted to do. It could do things like your tax calculations, it could do things like play games, it could run biorhythm programs, all these things that you didn't know you actually wanted, but it was part of the hype, and it was part of joining a future that was imminent. It was about to arrive, and if you didn't know how to use a computer, you would be left behind. And of course, this was particularly appealing, or particularly worked on parents. And of course, it was my parents who bought me the computer for Christmas.
I remember when I would have been 8 years old, and my mum brought home this ZX Spectrum. Hilariously, she said it was for computing in the home. It's like, yeah, right. And then after 10 minutes, that was it. As soon as they found out it could play games, it was never, I don't think anybody typed one letter on it. There's definitely a hierarchy, because there was a family who had very well-behaved kids and were very serious, and I think they got a BBC one because it was a little bit more clever and everything, whereas we were kind of rougher and more rebellious, and that's why we got the Spectrum, because by then, you know, people were just saying, yeah, that's just for games. The BBC one had a bit more kudos of being a bit more intellectual.
Even though the Sinclair Spectrum was largely seen as a games machine, to operate it you did have to have some technical knowledge.
When we first started, we realised obviously that there would be a games aspect, but the first appeal was to people who wanted to get their hands on one and do some programming themselves, which they loved doing. I mean, children took to that dramatically. And it's a bit sad today that that really isn't available to them. That's all changed. But in those days, you know, children could get hold of one of these and very swiftly learn to program.
It was a boom time for the home computer, with small companies inventing new models all the time. This revolution came to the attention of the computer giant, IBM, who up till then had specialized in mainframe computers. They decided to launch their own smaller machine, called the personal computer, or PC.
Today, a new IBM computer has reached a personal scale. A person can afford it.
But the IBM PC, because of the way that it was marketed towards a business audience, was very successful indeed. It overtook all expectations. It took IBM by surprise.
The IBM personal computer soon became the standard for computers in the office, to such an extent that the name PC became a general term. Despite the success of the new PC, there were problems. The personal computer, although affordable, could be infuriating to use. They still relied on the operator having to type in specific written commands.
If you can't get a computer to do anything but frustrate you, if you're having a hard time understanding computers,
the IBM PC was designed really as a conservative computer. It was a computer that could sit quite easily with what had gone before, which was compatible with earlier technologies. For that reason, it was very limited in its approach. Specifically, it had this rather ordinary text interface.
But there was a new revolution about to happen. In 1984, a company called Apple launched its Macintosh computer. Instead of typing in text, it introduced the user to pictures, computer icons. In an advert which has gone down in history, Apple promoted the idea of an interactive computer as a free spirit in a symbolic war against Big Brother, the big corporation. In other words, against IBM.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
As well as introducing the world to computer icons, the Macintosh popularized the mouse. This user-friendly approach turned computing into child's play and quickly became an industry standard. The origins of Apple had been that of small entrepreneurs, computer hobbyists. This was a defining characteristic of the computing world, particularly in the games market, where young bedroom programmers could still design outside the big companies. A lucky few making a fortune. Not least in Britain.
Let's play with kids.
This is a real-life computer game that any youngster can play.
Okay, with kids, level 1.
Like Space Invaders, it requires skill and luck, but the rewards for success can be immense. For David and Richard Darling, a schoolboy hobby has already brought them wealth beyond their dreams. Nothing, it seems, can stop them now.
We have business talent, so we can do what older businessmen can do. But I think the main thing is that we know, we were at the other end of the market, we know what the kids want, or we know what people want for their computers.
17 years after launching their bedroom enterprise, Codemasters are a multi-million-pound games company employing over 400 people.
When we first got involved in the industry, it was all based around home computers like the Sinclair Spectrum and the Sinclair ZX81 and Commodore 64 and computers like that. So we grew up really with thinking of it wasn't even video games, it was computer games. And then Nintendo launched the Nintendo Entertainment System, and that took off in America and really kind of overtook all the home computers, and the industry really changed into a console market.
The console, a dedicated games machine, had now become the more popular form of computers in the home. Although the PC was used at home by some, it was essentially an office machine. By the late 80s, there were two competing consoles which would dominate the market, Sega and Nintendo.
These machines were in many ways like computers. They weren't like the Pong machine, which could only play one game. They had microprocessors. They could play a whole series of games on cartridges. They were mainly, or almost entirely, marketed at children, rather than they didn't have this kind of didn't have this attempt to appeal to adult users. And they were just dedicated games machines. But they soon proved very popular.
Just how popular games had become was evident when Games Master, the first video games program, came onto our TVs in 1992. Presented by Dominic Diamond, it attracted an audience of millions.
Thank you very much. Lovely, thank you. Hello and welcome to Games Master. If you're tuning in for the first time, where have you been? But my, how tall you're getting. You're 4 weeks late, but we've all taken turns keeping this slot warm for your arrival. So sit yourself down, have a mug of chamomile, get out your joystick and give it a loving caress, because that's what we'll be doing here for the next half hour.
The growth of the console for gaming over the home computer, again, it's all to do with speed. When cartridge-based games came along with Nintendo and with the Sega Mega Drive, just slot it in, turn on, but you are there. You walk in the house and be 10 seconds from a surge of adrenaline. It's this thing that, that is the reason why people are playing these games in the first place. It's all about consoles just cut down the time between you and that adrenaline fix.
Meanwhile, in the world of the PC, things had become ever more sophisticated. One of the original and most famous of the computer nerds, Bill Gates, and his now multi-billion-dollar company Microsoft, were instrumental in turning the PC into a machine which could perform a multitude of tasks. It was even beginning to challenge the console's grip on the gaming market. That was until Sony introduced its PlayStation.
For years I've lived a double life. In the day I do my job, roll up my sleeves with the hoi polloi. But at night, I live a life of exhilaration.
With missed heartbeats and adrenaline.
Sony deliberately targeted an older audience. Their adverts could be rather more opaque and surreal.
You may not think it to look at me,
but I have commanded armies
and conquered worlds. I have no regrets.
At least I can say
I've lived.
They had a brilliant thing. They would go around all the clubs in Britain and would put PlayStations into clubs, into the chill out rooms. They would sponsor tents at rock festivals and have tents full of PlayStation, and this just branded the PlayStation as a cool older thing. Now, this means that late teens and adults think it's okay to buy it. It's not as embarrassing as going and buying a Nintendo, but it also means that younger kids, 12, 13, who want to be cooler than their friends, think, oh, let's go for the older thing. It really was the kind of bad, dangerous older brother.
As well as being fashionably cool, the PlayStation and other next-generation consoles seemed as though they were set to become the main form of computers in the home. But then, with the advent of the internet, suddenly and surprisingly, the dream of a multifunctional home computer was given a new lease of life.
The uptake of internet use in the home for sort of domestic or game purposes in the UK has very much boosted the sales of PCs. It's given the PC a new lease of life. A whole new set of uses, a whole new set of practices are built up around the PC in the home. For the first time, it's become a communication technology.
The computer has come an unimaginable way since its early days. From being a vast room-sized calculating machine which only scientists could use, to a machine you had to build and program yourself, the computer is now easily accessible to us all. Now, twice as many households own a computer than own a dishwasher. The PC, once used as a purely administrative device, can now be used to play music, films and DVDs, as a digital photo album, as an instant communication tool, and for playing games. But is the pace of technological advance now such that the home computer will soon become the victim of its own success?
What you have to remember is the origin of the home computer. The home computer arrived because processors got very, very small. It became possible to put a processor in practically anything. And that's still the case, and the technology is only going to get more sophisticated. So it's possible that rather than the computer taking on the functions of other household appliances, those other household appliances may themselves become computers in their own right.
What would happen? It won't attract the world. What would happen?